Let me introduce our speaker for today. Why is it that we're fascinated with gangsters, liars, murderers, thieves, and bullies? These individuals, nevertheless, are often treated like celebrities and are in some cases revered with awe and admiration. Whether they are real-life Al Capones or fictional Tony Sopranos, we may fear them, but we're also drawn to them. These people make a living out of living on the edge. Part of us craves that excitement in our own lives, but, not really. And perhaps that's why we find movies like The Godfather or last year's Eastern Promises so riveting. It gives us the vicarious thrill of living in peril for a couple of hours with the knowledge that we'll return to our safe, comfortable, happy lives once the film is over. We don't really feel like these menacing people can touch us as they operate in some shadowy parallel dimension that doesn't intersect with our own. Perhaps we shouldn't be so complacent, and our guest speaker today has documented in his mesmerizing book, McMafia, a journey through global underworld, is sort of a Lonely Planet guide to organized crime where no continent goes unexplained. Not McMafia, right? Sorry, Misha. From Bulgaria to Bombay to Brasilia in our very own British Columbia, he shows the net of the underworld spreads very wide indeed. Mr. Glenny uncovers the roots of modern organized crime, describes its current power, and traces its possible future growth. The tendrils of organized crime, he writes, have become enmeshed so thoroughly in the world's financial and political nervous system that it threatens to assume a far greater control than any of us might realize. There are the Nigerian email scam artists, the intercontinental pimps dealing in Eastern European women, and the armed entrepreneurs of Moscow. There are the Chinese heroin kingpins with ties to Communist Party bosses, and there are the money launderers of Dubai, the so-called washing machine of the world. Organized crime is international crime, and as Misha points out, they have benefited greatly from the globalization of finance and the easy flow of people and money around our globe. The fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of an ambitious China, and other political shifts we might consider positive events have paved the way for criminals to operate in a truly transnational way. To paraphrase Hyman Roth, the aging mob boss from The Godfather Part 2, they are bigger than U.S. Steel. Just how big can global organized crime grow, and what can we do to stop it? For his views on this fascinating topic, please welcome to our podium today, Misha Glenny.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for the invitation to the Canadian Club. This is a spectacularly good audience here. I'm very pleased and privileged to be here, and thank you, Alan, for the introduction. I'm going to shoot straight into my remarks, largely because of time constraints. I can witter on about this subject endlessly, but I'm going to try and be disciplined today. I started this book in April 2003. I was sitting on the terraces of the House of Commons, having a drink with a British Minister of the Crown. And the British Minister of the Crown was lecturing me on the Balkans, which is the area where I had been working for over 2 decades or so. And we were talking about the possible entry of various Balkan countries into the European Union, of which I'm a firm advocate. And he said to me, we're not going to let them in until they do more about organized crime, because this place is a factory of organized crime, and they've got to take responsibility themselves at the political level, highest political levels, to do something about it. Now, with politicians, I usually disguise any indignation I might feel, but on this occasion, I was regrettably unable to do so. And the reason why I was unable to do so is just a month before this, the Prime Minister of Serbia, Zoran Đinđić, had been assassinated in the center of Belgrade. And Zoran was a friend of mine. Most people assume that he was assassinated because he was interested in capturing the indicted war criminal General Ratko Mladic and sending him to The Hague. But in fact, the reason for his assassination, although the Mladic case may have had a bearing on it, the fundamental reason was rather different, and that was 3 months prior to his assassination, Zoran Djindjic had promulgated the first ever Witness Protection Act in southeastern Europe. And indeed, he had lined up one of the biggest gangsters from Belgrade, who was then under police protection in Vienna, to testify against some very powerful criminal interests in Serbia. Now, the irony of all this and of Zoran's assassination was that he was himself a gangster. But he was a good gangster. To understand why he was a gangster and how you can be a good gangster, we have to go back to 1989 and the fall of communism. I don't know if you recall, in the run-up to the fall of communism, there were no governments in the world that were anticipating the end of communism. Everyone thought that the Soviet Union was going to rumble on for another 20 or 30 years or so. And so when it happened, it took governments and most people in the West completely by surprise. So not only were they surprised by the event, no one had done any serious work on anticipating what would happen if the Berlin Wall fell. And very quickly we assumed that the whole of Eastern Europe would be made up of 250 million or so human rights activists like the Czechoslovak President Václav Havel, and that we would all be one happy bunch of freedom-loving people. And so that's what we thought was going to happen, but that's not what happened. In fact, rather different things happened, because it wasn't just the ideology of communism underpinned by a very powerful Russian nationalism that collapsed at the time. And although, don't get me wrong, the fall of the Berlin Wall was, for me, it was one of the greatest events of my life, because for 15 years or so prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, I had been involved in supporting opposition groups like Charter 77 and Solidarity in Poland, by, amongst other things, undertaking such actions as smuggling books and dismembered Xerox machines into Eastern Europe. So I know what I'm talking about when it came to crime, because I've been involved in it for 10 or 15 years or so myself. And so for me, 1989 was the culmination of all my political dreams and desires. But I, too, had not really worked out what was going to happen next. And as I say, it wasn't only the ideology that collapsed, it was the states that collapsed all over Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union as well. And when a state collapses, amongst other things, the police force tends to collapse, and the judicial and the court systems collapse as well. So you have this sudden vacuum all over Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And as we know, nature abhors a vacuum, and it wasn't very long before various characters were filling that vacuum. Now, I don't know if you remember before 1989, whenever the Olympics came along every 4 years, that the people who won the weightlifting and the wrestling competitions were always either from Bulgaria or Romania or the former Soviet Union in one guise or another. Well, these people were the celebrity superstars of the communist world, and their lifestyles were appropriately underwritten by the state. So they had access to free apartments in the center of town in Sofia, the capital of Bulgaria, for example. They wouldn't have to wait for 5 years before they got a car, and they were virtually guaranteed casual sex on tap and that sort of thing. They were real megastars. When 1989 collapsed and the funding of these lifestyles went with it, they were very unhappy bunnies, and they decided that they were going to do something about it. And because of the fact that the police forces and the court systems of Eastern Europe were no longer functioning, it wasn't very difficult, because they were very big and very strong. And so what they did was form what I refer to in the book in rather sort of pompous sociological jargon as privatized law enforcement agencies, but what we know more colloquially as protection rackets or the mafia. Along with our friends, the wrestlers and weightlifters, and in the case of Russia, the Afghan veterans who were pouring back from Afghanistan with very little to do and a lot of time on their hands and a lot of testosterone flowing through their body, there was another group of people who were also rather dissatisfied and unhappy with the way things had gone. Between 1989 and 1991 in Bulgaria, 14,000 members of the security services were sacked in the wave of democratic euphoria that accompanied the collapse of communism. So there were 14,000 people let out onto the jobs market when the economy was tanking, and their skills included building networks, included surveillance, smuggling, and killing people. Not a very good set of skills to have when the economy is, well, actually, quite the opposite. A very good set of skills to have when the economy is tanking. And they met up with their friends, the wrestlers and the weightlifters. And along with these two groups coming together all over the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, you had the introduction of the free market, capitalism, contract law, whatever you want to call it. The states of Eastern Europe had no idea how you regulate this. So basically what would happen is you have businessman A and businessman B, and they make a contract together to buy or sell something. If things go wrong, they need that dispute resolved. And so businessman A would employ the services and willingly pay for a group of wrestlers and or secret policemen to ensure that businessman B was going to, come up with his part of the deal. So the wrestlers and policemen of businessman A would meet, in the case of a dispute, with the wrestlers and policemen of businessman B, and they would sit down for a very civilized discussion and see if they could come to an agreement. If, as they did in 90% of the cases, they came to an agreement, then they would go back to their respective businessmen and say, okay, this is what you're going to do, basta, end of story, and the businessman would carry it out. If, however, they failed to come to an agreement at the meeting, they would say, right, okay, in that case we're going to go for razborka, which was the Russian phrase for another kind of meeting, which is translated as a shootout. And so it's sort of, pistols at dawn, 9 o'clock, Nevsky Prospect, if you please, except it wasn't pistols at dawn. It was rocket-propelled grenades and AK-47s at dawn and, bring all your mates. And so places like Bulgaria and Russia became the Wild East, absolutely extraordinary state of affairs. It looked very, very chaotic from outside, and a lot of people certainly died. But actually, these people were regulating the introduction of market economies in Eastern Europe, which is why I refer to them as the midwives of capitalism. Now, when you get protection rackets and people like that regulating markets, what tends to happen is they look around and they say, well, why are we just protecting these markets? Why don't we get involved in the markets ourselves? And because you don't have a functioning government and a court system and a police force which is defining what is illegal as a market and what is legal as a market, basically your protection rackets and your businessmen, who became later referred to particularly in Russia but also elsewhere as the oligarchs, define themselves what the markets are. And they find, well, they can make money out of oil, they can make money out of furniture, they can make money out of food, and hey, they can make money out of drugs, they can make money out of trafficking women and doing whatever they like. Because they are the law and order system in those countries. Now, and there wasn't much economy going on in other sectors. So, they look around and they look to see where is the market for these new goods and services that they've come across. And they look west to the European Union primarily. Now, whilst all the fall of communism is going on the one hand, a different set of processes are carrying on in the West, which is the liberalization of financial and commodity markets, opening up markets everywhere, allowing investment in places which previously were hostile to investment but have decided to open their markets to the West. You get a rapidly increasing flows of capital, of trade, and of migratory patterns as well. And in the short term in particular, this results in a very big injection of cash available to West Europeans, certainly, and Americans and Canadians as well. The European Union was developing into what has now become the largest consumer market in history. And a substantial, significant number of the citizens of the European Union liked to spend a considerable part of their leisure time and spare cash on taking drugs, on sleeping with prostitutes if they were men, and on employing illegal migrant labour. And that last practice went up right to the top of some states in the European Union, but just to keep you on your toes, I'm not going to tell you which ones I mean by that. You can try and guess yourselves. So there was this huge, rapidly expanding market for illicit goods and services from around the world. And that's where we come back to the Balkans. Because the primary function, in my estimation, of the wars in the former Yugoslavia was not as a way of expressing people's loathing and hatred of other ethnic groups. The primary function of the wars in Yugoslavia was to allow a small group of people on all sides of the conflict to make vast sums of money and build huge criminalized empires whilst exhorting their fellow citizens to indulge in mass slaughters of other populations in the former Yugoslavia. And one of the reasons why this was able to happen was because the demand for illicit goods and services, for goods and services from all over the world, had to get into the European Union somehow. And the former Yugoslavia was in the very place which traditionally had always been an area which smuggled goods from one empire to another. And so it reverted to its old historical function as the transit zone for goods and services from coming all over the world into the European Union. So what I did for the book was simply to follow those routes out of the Balkans, to go to various places around the world and see how this was, how these routes, these goods and services were integrating into an economic and very coherent whole which mirrors the practices of globalization and that I refer to as the global shadow economy. Now, there is one section of the former Soviet Union in Eastern Europe which is very specific, and that is Russia. And the reason why Russia was different was because the new business class, the new elite in Russia, had access to untold wealth because of their ability to get hold of the mineral resources of Russia, which are worth untold hundreds of billions. And they basically started committing what I refer to as the greatest larceny in history, which was to sell this on open markets and pocket the money and then start exporting the money from Russia. Between 1990 and 2000, between $200 and $300 billion was exported out of Russia by a small group of oligarchs who understood full well that the great bear of the Russian state was hibernating, but that this was a powerful residual beast, and at some time it would wake up from its hibernation with a cracking hangover, look around and see that somebody had been at its honey, and it would want to know where it had gone, and it would want it back. And that bear returned in the shape of Vladimir Putin, who, as we know, has a very sore head indeed. But before he woke up, $200 to $300 billion of cash was sent out of Russia just at the same time as the IMF was peculiarly sending between $200 and $300 billion into Russia to underwrite the ruble. So we were actually, as global taxpayers, underwriting the greatest larceny in history. This money had to go somewhere, and this again was the time of globalization, financial liberalization all over the world, and you had money centers all over the world competing for this capital that was coming out of Russia and Eastern Europe. And at the same time, so they were also competing for corporate money. And there were no questions being asked about the provenance of money going into the international financial and banking system. This was a very, very corrupting process, and we are still suffering the effects from it, and it has not yet been cleaned up. It is at the very heart of the global shadow economy, and it is one of the key sectors where the global shadow economy comes together with the licit economy, and where you can no longer tell what is black, what is white, and what are shades of grey. It's for this reason that when I talk about the global shadow economy as accounting for 15 to 20% of global GDP, I'm not just talking about organised criminal activity. That's not nearly as big. I'm including in that figure corruption, which is worth in itself, according to the United Nations, between $2 and $3 trillion. That's in 2006. And as well as being a significant chunk of global GDP itself, what corruption does is it multiplies the impact of all sorts of other types of criminality. I also include tax evasion in that, and corporate fraud as well, which generally come from the licit economy, but when they get into the financial sector, particularly when they're in offshore banking systems, it's very difficult to distinguish what is what and where it's coming from. So all sorts of countries around the world, not just the offshore centres, but places like the United Arab Emirates, Israel indeed, which saw a lot of Russian money come in the 1990s, Cyprus, which to this day, even though now a member of the European Union, is still a vast clearinghouse for very dubious sorts of money. That all continues to go on. But I want to have a look at for 2 or 3 more areas of the global shadow economy. The first one is what I believe to be the biggest crime of the late 1990s, certainly the biggest crime of the 20th century, although it straddles the millennium, so it also has an impact on the 21st century as well. And that was what happened again when the Soviet Union collapsed. The territories of the former Soviet Union were awash with weaponry, but awash with it. And because there was no use for it anymore, a lot of people from defense ministries, freelancers, soldiers, anyone who could get their hands on the stuff, decided to sell it on the open market. Fascinatingly, one of the places they sold it to was Croatia in the wars of the former Yugoslavia. And it's interesting because Russia was always seen as the great, solid, pan-Orthodox ally of Serbia in the Yugoslav wars, but it was also the biggest arms supplier to Croatia during the Yugoslav wars. So clearly there is a moment at which nationalism and national interests are entirely overcome by the desire and impetus to make money. And this is something that I found everywhere, with one exception, was that political and national conflicts are generally irrelevant when it comes to people involved in the global shadow economy. Now, the other place where those weapons were going very tragically was West and Central Africa. And in 1998, we saw the outbreak of a conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which was to become the bloodiest conflict in the world since the Second World War. A conflict which, in the space of about 5 or 6 years, 5.5 million people were killed as a consequence of that war. Now that's quite astonishing, 5.5 million people. I wonder how many people know that that's the case. We hear a lot about Darfur, where 300,000 people have been killed. I still to this day don't understand, why don't we hear about the Democratic Republic of Congo, where 5.5 million people have lost their lives? Well, I suppose it's complex issues, but let me tell you what that war was about. Weaponry from the former Soviet Union was pouring into the Democratic Republic of Congo via Kenya, via Uganda, via South Africa. It was being paid for by the incredibly rich mineral resources of the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, which is where almost all of the fighting and all of the killing went on. Now, some of those are minerals that we're familiar with, like blood diamonds, of which there's been a lot of very good work and a lot of solutions found as well, I'm glad to say. And also some good films like Blood Diamond itself, which really is quite good, although that's about West Africa. But another metallic ore that was being sold out of the Democratic Republic of Congo was called coltan, from which is derived a material that is used in every cell phone, every laptop, and every games console in the world. And at the turn of the millennium, 80% of the coltan used in the world was being mined in the killing fields of the Democratic Republic of Congo. The criminal syndicates who brought in the weapons to the DRC brought out the coltan and sold it into the licit market, where it was accepted by the manufacturers of electronic goods who were wittingly or unwittingly turning a blind eye to the provenance of this material. So all of us in this room, as I'm assuming we've all accessed cell phones, laptops, or games consoles at some point, all of us were complicit, unwittingly, complicit in one of the really the most significant crimes of the 20th and 21st century. And all this is facilitated by the global shadow economy. Now, the backbone of global shadow economy activity has for a long time been narcotics. We see this as very important startup capital for organized criminal syndicates all over the world. We also saw that with the culture of globalization, there was a terrific spread of narcotics usage in the past 15 to 16 years, partly because it was going to different places, countries like Thailand, Israel, which had not generally had, or Indonesia, a narcotics culture before, now joined in the global fun, as it were. South Africa became extremely important, both as a consuming nation of new drugs and as a transit nation for all sorts of drugs going from east to west, west to east. The whole of Eastern Europe opened up for the use of narcotics, and in some countries like Canada, you had a really significant expansion, both of cocaine and heroin usage, but of course, above all else, of the cultivation, production, export, and consumption of marijuana. And this is when I talk about British Columbia in the book as being home to the largest number of organized criminal syndicates per capita in the world. And the reason for that is very simple. I mean, I don't want to be unfair to BC. It's because the United Nations defines an organized criminal syndicate as two or more people involved in the commission of a crime. And of course, what you have in British Columbia is a very decentralized type of drug production, so that you have all these mum-and-pop agencies, so that the RCMP, when I spoke to them last October, estimates conservatively, on their admission, that's their word, that there are 25,000 grow operations in British Columbia, in residential units alone. That is excluding the industrial units that are used for marijuana production, and it's excluding the large outdoor farms in central and eastern BC, which really get going over the summer months. It's now, according to BC government statistics, it's now worth about 5% of the GDP of British Columbia's economy, which is why you will find large communities in central and eastern BC whose municipal leaders would not contemplate a dedicated assault against the marijuana trade in those areas, because the economies of certain towns and certain regions have become dependent on this trade. What you've had all over the world are similar types of increases, huge increase in the production of designer drugs, methamphetamines, ecstasy, and new ones are coming onto the market all the time. What you haven't had is any concomitant increase in the resources available to law enforcement to do anything about this. So if you have a policy of war on drugs, which relies on interdiction and punishment as its frontline weapons to reduce the consumption and production of narcotics, then you have to fund it properly. And the governments around the world are not willing or able to fund it properly. And so, as many law enforcement officials, senior law enforcement officials will tell you, in terms of do we make a difference to the amount of drugs circulating on the streets of the Western world? Absolutely not. That doesn't mean that they're in favor of legalization necessarily, although quite a few are. But what it means is that they confess that the policy in terms of its stated aims is not working. Now, this is all well and good. We can have this debate happily when we're sitting here in the Western world. But in Afghanistan, this is having a real impact. And for Canada, amongst other countries, it's extremely important. In 2003, the Taliban was a defeated force. It was over militarily, game, set and match. And for the first time in 150 years, the Western world had an opportunity to right all the wrongs that had been visited on the blighted country of Afghanistan with a proper, concerted program of development for that country. Instead, however, we decided— that's me, I'm talking for my government now, of course, not for yours. And the United States decided to invade Iraq and neglect Afghanistan. And at this point, the Taliban, no fools, decided it was time to reorganize, refinance, and rearm itself. And it rearmed and refinanced itself exclusively through the taxation of the opium trade. Since 2003, production has been rocketing in Afghanistan, over 50% increases every single year. And with the weapons that are acquired, with the tens of millions of dollars that the Taliban earns every month, NATO personnel are now being killed on a regular basis, and we are looking into the abyss of a possible defeat of history's greatest military alliance in Afghanistan, which would bring that alliance to its knees and leave Western security policy in Central Asia in absolute tatters. The war on drugs is making the war in Afghanistan impossible, and at one point policymakers are going to have to decide what they want more. Do they want a war on drugs, or do they want to secure Central Asia for proper, sensible development that will not enable people who wish us harm to multiply and develop their strategies there? Now, finally, before I end, two little things. One is cybercrime. I spent time in Brazil with some friends of mine who were crackers and hackers, as they're called. And I succeeded with my laptop. I haven't got it here, but I've got a lovely little picture of a packet of Pringles, the chips, which, you know, are so salty and delicious. And I attached a Pringles packet through a USB plug into my computer, and this was care of a friend of mine who I referred to as Super Geek. And Super Geek he opened the top of the Pringle packet, and out came a directional antennae. And with this directional antennae plugged into my laptop, we drove up and down the Avenue Paulista in Sao Paulo. I managed to break into 3 of Brazil's major banks. That was partly because of Mr. Pringle, of course, but also partly because of my friend Super Geek, who knew what to do once we'd got into their systems. Now, cybercrime is worth about $100 billion a year, it's estimated at the moment, but it is the fastest growing sector in the whole world. The interesting thing about cybercrime is that it's not technology that scuppers us, it's human behavior. 90% of cybercrime is about persuading people like you and me to do things with their computers which objectively are not in their interest. I don't know if you recall, but at the end of the 1990s, one of the first biggest global viruses to hit computers around the world was the I Love You virus. Now, I was very fortunate when the I Love You virus started going around, because the first person I received it from was an ex-girlfriend of mine. And she harbored all sorts of emotions towards me, but love was not one of them. So as soon as I saw it come into the inbox, it went straight away into the recycle bin, and I spared myself a very nasty infection. All I can say to you now is be extremely careful with your personal computers. Always have at least one antiviral, one anti-malware program, and for God's sake, if I can give you one piece of advice today, keep them updated properly. But even so, you're likely to be done. This is going to be a very, very big problem. Interestingly, governments around the world are beginning to channel billions of dollars, not so much in order to protect your credit cards and things like that, because as long as the banks are making much more money out of saving their cash on paying staff, because you're taking over the staff's work by doing everything on a computer, they will replace your cash. Once it gets to a critical level where they're not making so much money because of computer fraud, then they might start putting responsibility onto you. But governments are putting billions upon billions into cyber defenses now, not because of crime, but because of cyber security, because attacks are proliferating between governments around the world trying to get into each other's systems. But that's a different thing. And finally, very briefly, the future of organized crime. Well, we have a big problem. In the early 1990s, what we did was to shift our manufacturing capacity from the European Union and the United States and Canada, the West in general, and we shifted this over to China. Now, instead, we make our money out of creative industries and service industries. And so, as a consequence for us, intellectual property rights are a very, very important thing. The Chinese make their money out of selling goods to us in huge numbers. And for them, intellectual property rights are not a very, very interesting thing. In fact, they don't really care about them very much, and why would they? So this is becoming, because if you ignore intellectual property rights, you're generally involving the shadow economy at some level. I won't go into the details now because of the absence of time, but believe you me, it's not legitimate companies that are putting the lead paint into the Mattel toys. So what we're going to see over the next 10 to 15 years is a huge clash of the West and the emerging economies about how we should run the world, what is the legal basis for international trade? Because at the moment it's very unclear, and when things are very unclear, that means the actors in the global shadow economy have a fantastic opportunity to exploit it. And with that I'll end, and if there's enough time and anyone wants to answer me a question, I shall answer it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Misha. I think we've come pretty close to our time, so I'll just ask one question, and thank all of you for submitting the questions. But we've run out of time. But it was a great presentation. What advice might you have for businesses or individuals in the audience to protect themselves?
Well, in terms of cybercrime, if I was involved in a serious business, I would be. I would outsource my protection to one of the big companies which are monitoring attacks on corporations all around the world. I would generally not use in-house because in-house tends to be rather slack, to do with the nature of attacks on computer systems. There are some very good companies which now provide exceptional protection for corporations. For individuals, it's, as I'd say, I mean, you know, be very careful with your credit cards, be very careful at gas stations with your credit cards in particular, and be very careful about using credit cards over the internet. There are sites where you can be more certain about the security than other sites, but this is by nature a dangerous, risky business. For the moment, though, you should be safe because credit card companies and banks will refund you. But do be very careful about giving your personal details to anyone over the internet, because much worse than having, you know, £100 or $200 ripped off from your credit card is when you're the victim of identity theft, which is a growing problem, not just in the Western world, but all over. And it's extremely creepy when you arrive, say, at Zurich airport, and the first thing that encounters you is a policeman who arrests you for a crime which you have nothing to do with.
Well, thank you. I'm going to invite Chris May from the Institute of Chartered Accountants and Director of the Canadian Club to more formally thank you.
Well, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to thank Misha Glenny for this revealing look at the phenomenal and shocking story of the growth of organized crime. It truly is an important story to be told. As one-time White House operative and part-time criminal himself, G. Gordon Liddy once said, "Obviously crime pays, or there'd be no crime." And certainly it seems to be paying off better than ever, thanks to several historical developments that have opened up enormous criminal opportunities. Transnational crime is a shadow economy, accounting for an appalling large portion of global economic activity. and how obvious it seems, once Mr. Glenny explains it, that it could not exist except for the silhouette of the more visible global financial system. It is very disturbing to see how closely the global ambitions and methodology of crime syndicates mirror, in a perverse way, those of global corporations. Globalization has reduced trade barriers and opened the door of opportunity to people all over the world. It may have also opened a Pandora's box of trafficking and violence. The new century presents us with many challenges, and the rising tide of international crime could be one of the most greatest. Thank you, Misha Glenny, for sounding the alarm.
Thank you, everyone. That's the end of our lunch. Have a great afternoon, and we hope to see you soon.